Kwat, Westuhal, and welcome back to Learning Old English with the Wordhoard, a Medievolution Project production. And I am Richard Scott Nokes, your host. Today we are starting on verbs, so you should be reading the Verbs chapter of Baker's book. If you're working along with Drought, he has several different chapters, all of which are linked above this podcast here. And just a few words about verbs for you. First of all, verbs can be very intimidating. There are many, many different kinds of verbs. They all have these different paradigms. And, after getting through all those pronoun paradigms, you probably felt like, well, at least I have that done. And then when you get to the noun paradigms, even though you have different sorts of nouns, like athematic nouns and weak nouns and strong nouns and all this kind of thing, you did, I think, have the sense that they were following the same sorts of patterns that you saw with the pronoun paradigms. That is no longer the case with the verbs. You're starting an entirely new part of speech. But for now, you just want to learn, I would focus on studying three things. One is the basic verb paradigms, both weak and strong, found in table 7.1. That's the verb paradigm for freman, which is to do, and helpan, which is to help. And then the third thing I would work on is focusing at first is table 7.4, which is the paradigm for beon, the verb for to be. So just a couple of comments about this. Unless you've taken your modern English grammar recently, some of this present indicative, past indicative, present subjunctive can be a little bit confusing. So just a reminder. When we talk about present indicative, most of my students today tell me that in their high school classes, this is just called, in their grammars, the simple present. And past indicative is the simple past. And in fact, most of the verbs that you see are going to be present indicative or past indicative, simple past or simple present. Now that doesn't mean you can get away without learning those participles, without learning those imperatives, and without learning those subjunctives. You do have to learn those, but at first when you're translating, you're not going to run into those a whole lot. And in fact, I confess that when a lot of time goes on between teaching this class, I tend to lose track of the ones that aren't present indicative and past indicative, just because you see them a lot less frequently than you do the infinitive form and the simple past, simple present, the indicative past, indicative present. The other thing is that there's a lot of very intimidating grammar and philology talk in this chapter, and that tends to be the case. I know some people out there have written to me. Some of you are working through Drought. Some of you are working through Diamond. There are a few of you who are working with a couple of other texts as well. And there always tends to be this kind of complicated philology talk about I-stem mutations and this kind of thing. Let me just try to boil it down to its simplest form. The difference between the weak and strong nouns. Weak and strong verbs. A weak verb would work a lot like our modern English word for walk, to walk. If you want to make to walk in the past tense, you simply add an ed to the end. Walked. So you have walked, walks, walking. In other words, walk, the basic part, the stem, will always stay the same. And that's what you tend to see in the weak noun paradigms. When we're saying a weak verb paradigm. When we're saying the weak verb paradigms, what we're really saying in a lot of ways are those verbs which tend not to change the stem at all. Strong verbs, on the other hand, act more like our modern English verb to run. To run in the past becomes ran, not runned. And if you've ever heard a toddler learning to talk, toddlers try to apply this end and ed to everything that doesn't work that way, like the verb to run. And so what happens with run is the U in run turns to an A in ran. In other words, the stem, run, mutates. The stem changes. And that's how the strong verbs work too. So if you look, for example, at table 7.1 and you see helpan, okay, you'll see helpan, to helpane, ilch, helpe, and then when you get into the second person, you start seeing hilpest, where that E has mutated, transformed into an I. And then later on, you'll see through hulpe, where that E has transformed into a U. And then all the way down to the participles, you'll find holpen, where that E has transformed into an O. Basically, what you're going to see in the strong nouns is it working like our words for run, which becomes ran, in that the stem, in the vowel in it will change. And that can be confusing, no doubt. But those changes tend to follow certain patterns that you will pick up eventually. One last thing I want to say about the verbs before going. The table for bayon, the paradigm for bayon, the verb to be. Baker says this is a mess. That's really understating it. This is a very difficult verb, no question. You've got a bunch of different, word kind of squished in together. So in your present indicatives, they tend to start with vowels, and then unless you're using the bayo bith, and then you've got these B's in there. And then when you get to past, suddenly they have these W beginnings. And this is really annoying and difficult. But if you think about it, it hasn't really changed much in the last millennium and a half at this point. It's really basically the same today in modern English. The verb is to be, but it's am, is, and are, which don't really seem to follow from the infinitive be. And then when you get to the past tense, suddenly we have these W's, was and were, that are in there. And if you think about it from that perspective, you realize that it really has changed very little over the ages. And, unfortunately, it's very irregular, and you're just going to have to learn it. You're not going to get very far in Old English if you don't know the verb to be. So, before we go, I'm going to read to you the vocabulary for next time. Now we are done looking at verbs. Obviously, there are a lot of very important verbs that we haven't looked at. The verbs that we use were keyed to the vocabulary that Baker uses. Now we're moving into adjectives, and these adjectives are nice because there tend to be a lot of cognates that are very similar to modern English. You do have to be careful for false friends or words that have sometimes changed their meaning very slightly. So, here are your vocabulary for next time. God, which means good. Hwat, which in this case means vigorous. Hard, which is hard or fierce. Milde, which means kind. Hali, which is holy. Sveatul, which is clear. Eld, which is old. Yeong, which is young. Her, which is high. Lang, which is long. Strang, which is strong. Little, which is small or little. Michel, which is large. Evil, which is bad. And wise, which is wise. So be very careful. There are a few in there that might trip you up. Milde doesn't exactly mean mild. It means something more like kind. If you understand that hard means hard without understanding it also means fierce, you might have some difficulty later when they're talking about someone being, maybe a person being hard. They don't mean that, they don't necessarily mean they have six-pack abs. So, until next time, enjoy your Old English and start working on that translation of Wulfstan, who happens to be one of my favorite figures from Anglo-Saxon England.